Good day. Over the previous couple of days, the previous week, it was extremely difficult to keep up with the situation in Ukraine. The situation had become incredibly dynamic. There was a Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, which began at the very tail end of August. And then we had the situation in Kharkiv region with the Ukrainian offensive, which has taken place there. Over the last 2 days, things have been much more stable. It seems that the Russian forces have taken up their positions along the Oskol River line. There's some sort of a gathering of Ukrainian forces near Ugledar and talk of a Ukrainian offensive being launched from there. There's intense fighting going on around the small Donbass town of Krasny Liman, as the Ukrainians call it. The Ukrainians seem to be trying to recapture that town, which was captured by the militia, the Donbass militia, over the course of the fighting in the summer. For the moment, the militia seem to be holding their ground successfully in Liman or Krasny Liman. We'll see if anything changes there. And elsewhere on the battlefields, we get the news that the militia, which is now once again being reinforced by the return of the Chechen forces that were pulled out of Donbass following the capture of Lysychansk, that these Ukrainian forces, that these Chechen forces are now returning to the battlefields in Donbass, and we're also getting increasing amounts of news that the forces, these militia forces, are continuing their advance, their steady, grinding advance near Donetsk city and near Bakhmut, which is the main area, the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. So for the moment, things are a little more stable than they have been. That, of course, is a very qualified and conditional thing. It may change from one moment to the next. Programs that I've done up to now have described one situation, and by the evening, when the program is actually published, the situation has completely changed. And who knows, that may happen again to this program as well. And I'm going to say as well that there's been a certain amount of pushback from one or two people, one person in particular, saying that I'm engaging in too much speculation or guesswork about what's going on. I should say that this is informed guesswork. I don't just come up with thoughts about things out of nowhere. I have to look at events and analyze them and explain what I think. Otherwise, what is the point of this program? And I want to make this absolutely clear that every single speculation that I make is factually based, though they are sometimes coloured by my own experience, as is always and invariably the case. Anyway, I've discussed in my previous two videos the, I think, really quite fundamental mistakes, the major mistakes that the Russian leadership has made in handling the Kharkiv situation. In this program, I'm going to look at this more from the Ukrainian point of view and ask, what have they actually achieved, which is a practical value. We've had the psychological uplift Ukraine has undoubtedly had as a result of this success, the successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. But what, in meaningful terms, has Ukraine actually achieved? But I think in order to do that, some mathematics, or maybe not mathematics, let's say basic arithmetic is in order. Now, once again, I want to make it clear that I'm relying here essentially on Russian sources. The Russians tell us very little about their own forces, their own force structure in Ukraine. As I said, it only became clearly apparent to me a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, that the fighting in Donbass is being conducted almost entirely. I should stress, I mean here, the infantry fighting in Donbass is being almost entirely conducted by the Donbass militia. Russian infantry forces, motorized, mechanized infantry, tank forces, have not been involved basically since the capture of Mariupol way back in, I think it was May. So we have not seen much indications of Russian ground forces playing any active role in the fighting in Donbass. The militia there has been supplemented by the Chechen troops who withdrew on extended leave after the capture of Lysychansk back in June, but are now being redeployed in numbers to Donbass, and of course also by this strange Wagner outfit, which, it has to be said, does appear to be an extremely effective and professional force, but whose size I simply can't quantify. Anyway, we don't have much detailed understanding of what Russian formations are like elsewhere. One gets the sense that there's an awful lot more Russian troops operating in the south of Ukraine, in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, perhaps in southern Donbass, close to Ugledar, which I will come to shortly. But in the major battlefields in Donbass, the Russians, it seems, after their major withdrawal from around the areas around Kiev and Chernigov and Sumy, they seem to have pulled back most of the forces that they committed at the start of the conflict back in February. They seem to have pulled them back to Russia itself. A group of forces was maintained in ETHEREUM, a Russian group of forces, and this is what I'm now going to talk about and where the arithmetic comes in. Now, a Russian journalist working for Russian state television, somebody who has a lot of access to information on the ground, and somebody who gives me the impression of being very well informed, has said that over the last couple of months since the war began, Ukraine has built up a reserve striking force of around 10 brigades. That would be perhaps 30,000 men. And this force consists of troops who've been retrained or have trained in conjunction or with the assistance of the Western powers over the last few months, and have been re-equipped with weapons supplied by NATO. Polish tanks, Czech, Slovak tanks, these are principally T-72s, and Western armoured vehicles, the quality of which, by the way, many people tell me is not very high, but I'm not going to go down that path of looking into the utility of this or the reality of this. These 10 brigades also do possess a certain amount of self-propelled artillery, though they remain heavily outgunned by Russian brigades of the Russian army, which operate with far heavier artillery than is the case of brigades fielded by NATO armies. So that's about 10 brigades. If that's correct, we're talking around 30,000 men. Now, that doesn't, of course, approximate to some of these staggering numbers about Ukrainian forces that we are hearing. I mean, there's been talk about Ukraine having a 1 million-man army, a force of hundreds upon hundreds of thousands, all equipped with Western weapons, it seems much more plausible that in terms of the re-equipped reserve that Ukraine has been building up since the start of the war, a force of around 30,000 out of an aggregate Ukrainian armed army of perhaps around 300,000, that seems to me to be approximately correct. Now, this same journalist, the same Russian journalist, said that Ukraine divided this force in September and that a part of it was committed to the attack, the offensive in Kherson region, and another part of it was committed to the attack in Kharkiv. And that, by the way, corresponds fairly closely to what we know about these two offensives. The offensive in Kharkiv region appears to have involved around the equivalent of about 5 brigades of Ukrainian troops. That would be around 15,000 men. And the first wave of Ukrainian forces committed to the Kherson offensive, the forces that we saw carrying out the initial assault attacks in the Kherson offensive, they also numbered around 15,000 men, and they were clearly equipped with Polish tanks and Western armoured vehicles, and that, as I said, corresponds closely to the information this particular Russian journalist has given us. So Ukraine, instead of holding back this force of 30,000 trained troops, as apparently the Ukrainian General Staff has advised, instead of retaining this reserve and using it and perhaps building up on it, has instead launched it into 2 offensives, one in Kherson region, one against Kharkiv region. Now, assuming all of this is correct, and I've no reason to doubt it, it seems to be based on fairly accurate information which the Russians possess. That gives us some idea of the total size of the Russian forces in ETHEREUM, the Russian forces who were facing this Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv region. A Russian civilian official who had the task of administering this region says that the Russian forces in the Izium-Balaklia area were outnumbered by the Ukrainians by around 8-1. Now, that puts the size of the Izium grouping at less than 2,000 men, perhaps a depleted brigade. Now, that may come as a surprise to people, but it is fully consistent with what we've seen coming from the battle area. There were no Russian regular troops in Balaklia. There don't seem to have been any Russian regular troops in Kupiansk or that area where the fighting took place near the Oskol River. In fact, there don't seem to have been many Russian regular troops at all in any part of this region. So a force of perhaps 2,000 men in ETHEREUM is consistent with what we've seen of this battle. Now that, I'm afraid, bears out my view about what has been happening probably over the course of several weeks, which is that the Russians have been drawing down their forces in ETHEREUM for some time. And Andrei Martyanov has said that over a fairly lengthy period of time, a large number of people. Civilians were also being quietly evacuated from this area of the conflict, and though I'm afraid quite a few have remained, and some Russian channels are claiming that they're now experiencing reprisals from the Ukrainian troops who've occupied this area, which of course I cannot confirm. But anyway, putting all that aside, it seems likely that that force had been depleted, and the fact that if civilians were indeed being told to leave, then that suggests that the Russians some time ago decided to evacuate their forces from this part of Kharkiv region. And it's all consistent with the overall picture which we have seen. So, a drawdown of Russian forces, a relatively small number of Russian troops in ETHEREUM, a Ukrainian offensive launched in this area by Ukraine using these freshly trained and freshly equipped troops, built up brigades, built up apparently over the last couple of months, and re-equipped with Western equipment, thrown into battle against a very weakened force, and obviously planning to encircle this very weakened Russian force. And by the way, this is not, again, speculation. It's all over the Russian internet that that was the Ukrainian plan. And the penultimate report, by the way, from the British Ministry of Defence, well, I read it as indicating some disappointment that the plan to encircle and to destroy the Russian grouping in ETHEREUM, 2,000 men, whatever it was that was there, that there's been some disappointment that that was not achieved. So Ukraine has recaptured an extensive amount of territory. It's humiliated Russia. It's given Ukrainian troops all over the battlefield an enormous spring in their step. It's also demoralized the Russians themselves. But what it has practically achieved is the recapture of two relatively small places: ETHEREUM, which before the war had a population of around 40 to 50,000, Balaklia, which had a population of 20 to 25,000, and a number of villages which apparently had become largely deserted. There's no major industrial facilities apparently in this area, though ETHEREUM was something of a logistics hub. This is not apparently very useful or strong territory. It might also be, though I'm not certain that this is correct, territory which the Ukrainians might find as difficult to hold on to as the Russians did. The Russians, lacking a clearly defined front line on the western flank of their ETHEREUM group, had to spend an inordinate amount of time parrying Ukrainian attacks on their western flank. Pulling back to the Oskol River, which is what the Russians appear to have done, appears to have stabilized their western flank and to have given them a barrier, a clear barrier that they can build against. And if it is indeed the case that these Iranian drones are going to appear on the scene fairly soon, and the Iranians perhaps have given their first hint that these drones are indeed on the way, then the Russians will now have a system, drones, that they can deploy in quantity, which should enable them to patrol the Oskol River and perhaps also patrol other rivers like the Ingulets in Kherson region, enabling them to destroy Ukrainian pontoon bridges before they're completed, intercept Ukrainian infiltrators, do that kind of thing. So Ukraine has captured a certain amount of territory. but it has also suffered very heavy losses. Now, I've been one of these people who've been wondering about these claims that the Russians repeatedly make about the heavy losses that they claim to have inflicted on the Ukrainians. I've always had difficulty understanding how the Russians are able to give these very precise figures, which, to be honest, I still don't know. I mean, no doubt there are ways of doing it. Maybe they've broken into Ukrainian communications. Maybe they're tracking the communications that the hospital people are doing. I have no idea. But increasingly, these numbers that the Russian Ministry of Defense churns out every day for the number of Ukrainian troops who have been killed in the fighting, they are increasingly getting corroborated by other sources. And by other sources, I mean Ukrainian sources. Now, when we stack up the casualties that the Ukrainian forces that carried out the Kharkiv offensive have suffered from Russian artillery and airstrikes and missile strikes, then we are talking about losses of perhaps 2,500 up to 3,000 men killed, if you believe the Russian figures, out of an aggregate force of around 15,000 men. And the losses suffered by the Ukrainian forces that were deployed against Kherson region, well, they are apparently bigger still. So 6,000 to 8,000 men out of your reserve, your total reserve, your built-up reserve of around 30,000. These 10 brigades have been very badly knocked about as a result of the offensives that Ukraine has carried out over the last couple of days, over the last 2 weeks of September. In Kherson region, so far, they've achieved nothing of any significance. In Kharkiv region, they've captured 2 small towns, a number of empty villages, and a lot of territory, which is, however, of little practical use to them. But it seems that Ukraine is not going to stop. Earlier today, I was getting reports that some of these units have now been deployed, as I said, to try and attack Krasny Liman. They've not apparently been able to capture Krasny Liman, at least as of the time of this video. Krasny Liman is being defended by a unit of the Donbass militia, which is one of the best and toughest units of the Donbass militia. So it seems as if the Ukrainians are not able to just steamroll in, as they did in Kharkiv region, against minimal opposition. Here they're facing a fight, and for the moment their attacks have been repelled. There's increasing talk about a Ukrainian offensive south of Ugledar, and there's been reports that a train came to Ugledar with 150 items of equipment, and that the Ukrainians are clearing minefields around Ugledar with the intention of launching some sort of an offensive there. The problem is there are Russian regular troops in some quantity not far from Ugledar, and these include naval infantry, in other words marine forces, the forces that were instrumental in the capture of Mariupol, and these are highly trained Russian regular troops, and that does make the idea of a Ukrainian offensive from Ugledar, well, shall we say, it makes it much more doubtful in its outcome than the one in Kharkiv region. And there was a report I read earlier today, which of course is again one of the most speculative reports, but it's supposed to come from sources within the Ukrainian leadership, that Zelensky, emboldened by his victory in Kharkiv region, is now demanding that many of the troops who have been sent to Kharkiv region, that these assault troops, Western assault troops, be redeployed to Kherson region to renew the offensive there. Now, to me, that looks like Ukraine frittering away its reserves, exactly as the General Staff apparently warned Zelensky would happen when they apparently advised against launching any offensives at all. I'm not going to add up all the numbers because of losses, because this is all very speculative still, based on Russian claims. But if we're talking about, say, 4,000 on the Kherson front, 4,000 men killed, 2,000 in the Kharkiv front, 2,500 on the Kharkiv front, perhaps 3,000 killed. Let's say 6,000 to 7,000 men in total. That's a fifth of your total trained reserve that's already been killed. Now, one of the myths about this war, which I've discussed many times, is that Ukraine has a bottomless reserve of troops that it can simply throw away in the fighting, that they can just keep on gumming, sending human wave after human wave against the Russian defenders until those defenders are overwhelmed. I'm not going to repeat what I said. I discussed this whole theory, this idea, in a program I did recently. I said that, in my opinion, Ukraine is not fighting the war in that way, and that if it tried to fight that war, it would certainly lose. But what is true, it seems to me, is that the Ukrainians at the moment are in serious danger of getting dizzy with success. Whatever you may think about the events of the last couple of weeks, and I've made it fairly clear what I think about them, the Russians, it's clear, have suffered very few casualties on the Kharkiv front. Their force in ETHEREUM, such as it was able to withdraw intact. Even the various Rosgvardia detachments that were deployed across Kharkiv region to maintain order, to deal with Ukrainian infiltrators, to deal with that kind of thing, they too were apparently withdrawn with hardly any losses. A Ukrainian soldier himself admitted that in the fighting in Kherson region, Ukraine loses 5 men for every Russian soldier killed. And Bernhardt of the Moon of Alabama thought that the ratio might be even greater, more like 10 to 1. And I'm not going to argue with him. So Ukraine is throwing away large numbers of lives of its best soldiers on these offensives, which in Kherson region have achieved nothing, and which in Kharkiv region have won what is essentially and ultimately a psychological victory. It can't keep on doing this, and not only can it not keep on doing this, if it continues to do this, it could very well find itself in a position where its key reserve has been thrown away. Now, over the last couple of days, I've noticed lots of people on various Telegram channels have been coming up with all sorts of parallels with battles in the Second World War. There's been a lot of discussion, in my opinion, and I'm going to say this straight away, discussion which I don't find relevant or meaningful about the Kharkov offensive, the ill-starred Kharkov offensive of the spring of 1942 in this particular area of Donbass, of Kharkov region. And there have been other parallels as well. But perhaps a better way of looking at this, if you want us to draw historical parallels, which by the way is always a dangerous thing to do, is to consider what happened during the Second World War in the West, in the period between roughly December and 1944 and January 1945. Germany, in the preceding period, had actually managed to build up a significant number of armoured forces. And there's stories, I mean, I'm not a military historian, but I've read that the German staff wanted to husband these resources so that they could block off whatever offensives the Western Allies and the Soviets were planning over the previous months. But the German leadership had other ideas. And there were, in fact, between December and January, a whole succession of German offensives. The one that most people know about is the one that took place, most people in the West know about, is the one that took place in the Ardennes in 1944, but there was also offensives in Hungary. There was, by the way, an offensive in Italy. There were all kinds of offensives in all sorts of places. And none of these offensives ultimately changed the course of the war. Most people that I've read who know about these things seem to assume that these offences, though they gained in the short term, in many cases, significant ground and created shockwaves on the part of both the Western Allies and indeed the Soviets, that most of these offensives, all that they eventually managed to do was to severely deplete that reserve which the German staff had been husbanding and holding back to plug any gaps that might arise as a result of offensives in any part of the front. And why did the German leadership do that? Well, again, there's been much discussion about this. There's been suggestions that the Germans were gambling on some kind of knockout blow. But perhaps one can understand this better as a psychological thing. The need for a government that was sensing that things had been going very badly wrong, its need to launch offensives in order to reassure itself psychologically that it was still in the battle. As I said, maybe, just maybe, that's the better parallel to draw. There's been more information that Ukraine is now on the brink of a major economic cataclysm. And I was reading today that Ukraine is now going to try and reduce its deficit next year, its monthly budget deficit from the present $5 to $7 billion to $3 billion. There's no explanation of how it's going to do that. There's the fact that Western financial aid is coming nowhere close plugging the gap. And perhaps the most interesting thing of all was that despite all the brave words that came out in Ramstein, from the meeting in Ramstein, about the Western powers providing even more advanced weapons to Ukraine, the overall story was that most of the assistance that the Western powers will provide from this point on will not be in the form of more weapons, but rather in the form of training. The reason is Western arsenals have now become severely depleted. Western militaries are pushing back against the supply of more military aid to Ukraine. The emphasis now is on restarting arms production, first and foremost, in order to stock up Western arms supplies. So it's highly likely that though Ukraine may get some more advanced systems like these ATACMS long-range missiles that we've been hearing about, the overall number of weapon systems that will actually go to Ukrainian units fighting on the front line, that they will dwindle. And we may be also starting to see a shift in Russian tactics. Now, this is where I'm going to discuss these Russian missile attacks on Ukraine's power grid, which have taken place over the last few hours. Now, when the Russians started their special operation back in February, the mantra that was coming out of the Russian Defense Ministry, undoubtedly on orders from Putin himself, was that there would be no attempt by the Russians to occupy Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian cities would be left alone, and Ukrainian infrastructure would not be targeted. Civilian infrastructure would not be targeted. The Russians would only attack Ukrainian military infrastructure. In other words, the defense plants that Ukraine relies upon to keep had been relying upon to keep its army equipped. As so often happens in war, and one of the reasons, by the way, why I detest war, is that these Russian good intentions, I'm putting the word good intentions in inverted commas, have gradually been eroded away as Ukraine has been receiving weapon systems from the West, and as the West and Ukraine have escalated. So over the course of the last few hours, Russia did attack civilian infrastructure. They attacked the Ukrainian power grid. Now, the Russians are clearly embarrassed at some level by the fact that they've done that. There's been attempts by Russian officials to link this to the Ukrainian attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. And it is a fact that the Ukrainians have indeed been shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power station and have been trying to recapture it. So the Russian statements over the last couple of hours appear to be linking these attacks on the Ukrainian power system to the attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. But it's also the case that knocking out the Ukrainian power system means that Ukrainian electrically powered trains, which is to say the vast majority of them, have been unable to move. And it does seem that the Russians took advantage of that to attack stationary trains, particularly trains caught in railway stations and railway junctions, destroying large numbers of Ukrainian troops in the process. Now, it may be that the Russians will now continue to do this, that they will start to intensify and repeat these attacks over the next few days and weeks. To be very clear, these strikes on the Ukrainian power grid can only have happened with the express authorization of Russia's political leadership, which means, of course, Vladimir Putin himself. So, what we see is that the Ukrainians have made gains on the battlefields, but the risk they run is that those gains will be ephemeral and that Ukraine's strategic position is going to continue to deteriorate. And if the Russians, by the way, continue attacks on the Ukrainian power grid, they will intensify even more. All of this as Ukraine's economy reels towards collapse. Ukraine's reserve may have been depleted, its military reserves may have been depleted, and as Ukraine's people suffer even further. Let me reiterate again what I have been saying all along. Ukraine has gained its psychological win over the last few days. You can't gamble. It's reckless for Ukraine and its leadership to gamble that they really do have the Russians on the back foot. Perhaps they do. But all the indications to me suggest that the Russians are much more likely, given the political stakes for the Russian leadership, if nothing else, which I've discussed in recent programs. It's much more likely to me, it seems much more likely to me that the Russians will hold out and perhaps escalate, that they'll do the things that I've been discussing over previous programs, send more troops to Ukraine. They have them in abundance. Any idea that the Russians can't match 30,000 Western trained troops from the huge reserves that they have in their own country is fatuous. Anyway, that the Russians will at least match whatever the Ukrainians have and quite likely exceed it. And of course the Russians still have this enormous advantage. In fact, it's probably increasing, of being able to launch missile strikes anywhere in Ukraine that they wish. And their air force has been operating both over Kherson region and over Kharkiv region almost unchallenged. So rather than talk about victory, what the Ukrainian leadership needs to do is to cash in its winnings over the last few days and sit down and talk peace. They may be in a stronger position to do that than they have ever been at any time since the abortive negotiations in March and April. The risk they run is that if they don't, the situation could reverse again. And in conditions of an economic crisis, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe itself, they might find again that whatever window for negotiations they still have has closed, and perhaps closed permanently. Anyway, that's me for the day. We'll see what the Ukrainians do. For the moment, as I said, they're dizzy with success, despite, as I said, these massive attacks on their infrastructure and the heavy losses that they have apparently suffered. But perhaps if they sober down over the next few days and weeks, maybe they will start to shift gear. But we will see what they do. Anyway, that's me for the day. Just to reiterate, you can find all my videos and Duran videos and Alex Christoforou videos on our other platforms, on Locals first and foremost, also on Rumble, on BitChute, on ODYSEE, and of course on Telegram. You can also support our work if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And of course, don't forget to go to our shop and buy yourself the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button. Please remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.